Welcome to the second season of Women at Iowa, a series that explores the history and experiences of women at the University of Iowa. I'm your host, Karissa Haugeberg. Today's episode is part of an ongoing series in which we interview recipients of the Jean Y. Jew Women's Rights Award. Today's guest, Karla Miller, won the award in 2006. Karla is the executive director of the Rape Victim Advocacy Program, known as RVAP. Today, we will discuss the history of RVAP, Miller's research on people who commit sexual assault, and the relationship between alcohol consumption and sexual violence. Karla, thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
You were born in Illinois and raised in Iowa. Your father was a minister, and you've mentioned to me that your mother, a homemaker, instilled you with a strong sense of integrity. How so?
Well, early on, stressing the importance of honesty and also making me aware of things that weren't fair and things like that. And so really, and I took it very much to heart in terms of being able to see things, I feel, that were fair or unfair, and then becoming an advocate to try and address it.
Okay. And what about your father? Do you think that his profession in the ministry influenced the way that you look at the world or look at people?
Yeah, he became a minister at the age of 38, and prior to that had worked for a couple of companies, in sales. And when I was in my kind of like 9 years old to on up for a while, felt that I was very, very religious in terms of, there's going to be a better place. There's, really liking all of the kind of accoutrements that went along with religion.
So he instilled you with a sense of social justice?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
How did you wind up at the University of Iowa?
Well, I actually came to Iowa City in 1972 and became an X-ray tech, which I did for several years. And then I also had a career in music, and then in 1977 I changed. I was volunteering for the Rape Victim Advocacy Program, and in '81 became the executive director.
Okay. Would you describe the feminist community you were a part of in Iowa City during the 1970s? For example, the early formation of the Rape Crisis Line.
Mm-hmm. It was a very exciting time in terms of change and awareness. There were lots of consciousness-raising groups, and actually RVAP started out of that. Where they were looking at issues that were important to women, such as child care, economic issues, and certainly violence, and access to health care, all of those kinds of things. And so out of that, many of our human service agencies came to be.
Okay.
With RVAP, what happened is that there were, in about 1972-73, a group of women got together and called themselves Women Against Rape. And again, did a lot of consciousness raising and really looking at what were the barriers to women who were faced with sexual abuse or sexual harassment. What kinds of things were they running into in institutions that they reported to, and getting help. And out of that then, some volunteers talked to an attorney in town. I think his last name was King, and he volunteered his office at night for them to stay there and answer the rape crisis line, the early rape crisis line. And then as the program became a little more formal, when there was a half-time work-study student that came through the Women's Resource and Action Center, and at that time Linda McGuire was the director of the center, and there was a woman named Karen Letty, and she was actually the first kind of director to start putting the program together in a more formal way. And then shortly after that, Terry Kelly became the director for several years and really grew the program, not only in terms of the direct services to victims, but also in terms of looking at and critically thinking about all of the related issues and all of the types of oppression and violence that there are. For example, I brought with me today a couple of the early books that there were talking about incest. So The Best Kept Secret, Sexual Abuse of Children. Certainly we had talked about just a classic, Against Our Will, which was really pivotal in helping people think in a critical way about the issues and sorting them out and learning to have a language about violence and about oppression.
Okay. And can you explain the role of the university in this early organizing? How important was it to have that institutional support?
You know, the person who was really, I think, one of the most important people, if not the most important institutionally, was Philip Hubbard. And Mr. Hubbard was very supportive of both the crisis line and other kinds of services and programming that we were doing. And he helped us be able to start a Safe Ride program at that time, be able to figure out funding both within the university, with the University of Iowa student government, and then also going out into the city, the county, United Way, eventually United Way. And so other types of support we got from the university is the University of Iowa student government has always supported the Rape Victim or the Rape Crisis Line.
Okay.
And with their funding, and they've paid for the salary of directors, for example. They also now currently they don't pay for my salary, but they pay for a prevention education person, and they cover operating costs. One of the most important things that we have too is the university gives us in-kind services. So from the space that we're in to risk management, they manage our payroll. They do a lot of things that many freestanding agencies would have a difficult time and are having a difficult time doing because they don't have that kind of institutional support.
So it's been a commitment of the universities to support this.
Exactly. And one other person that has been very critical in helping us in the early days and also still is Belinda Marner.
Okay.
And she works in the Office of Student Services. And she has really been the one who has helped us as we've grown in doing all the things that we need to do accountability-wise, but also in just giving us support in terms of emotional support and really respecting what we do.
Let's contextualize rape victim advocacy in the 1970s a bit more. At the University of Iowa, daycare was a really big issue in the 1970s because it was a way to enable women to go to university, especially women with young children.
That's right.
Why was that a big issue for feminists in the 1970s?
It was a big issue because it is used in so many ways to control women. And it becomes, everything from, as I mentioned about Against Our Will, putting it into a historical context in which rape is a weapon or a sign of victory, or it's the spoils of conflict. And still, that has carried through historically into the everyday lives of women in limiting their movement and their choices and being something that is used as a control.
And for people at home who are young and weren't around in the 1970s, what was it like to start talking about these issues in an organized fashion in the 1970s? Were you supported? Was it considered to be radical to talk about sex in public?
It was very, very radical. And as I said, it was an exciting time, and it was a powerful thing, to be able to articulate, as I said, to develop a language in which you're able to put it into a social context. For example, in sexual assault, how the world had treated victims pretty much up to that point was in saying there was something wrong with the victim and the people who were the recipients of violence. And in a feminist viewpoint, really turned that around by saying there's something wrong inherently in society, and the victim is responding to something normally. She is responding normally to an abnormal situation, and that's one of the things that Judith Herman, who's one of the pioneers, phrased it, which I thought was really good because it really takes the idea that women are sick or weak or whatever, and it just says this is what happens to people when they are terrorized and when they are injured.
Mm-hmm. And it sounds, in previous conversations I've had with you, it sounds like Iowa City was a particularly dynamic place to be because it was one of the very first resources for rape.
That's right. We were one of the first in the country, and it was an exciting thing because we're in a university setting, and so of course critical thinking is encouraged, and really starting to look at what is the oppression, not just of women, but people of color, gays and lesbians. I mean, just the whole kind of gamut of marginalized groups, and certainly children in there as well. At the same time that we were looking at sexual assault, in particular, domestic violence intervention program, and at that time it was DVP, and they were working on issues of battering and women who had to leave their homes quickly. They didn't have a safe place to go. They had to keep their kids in school and get fed and all of those kinds of things. And so it was, it was a real activist time. You mentioned daycare centers a while ago, and I immediately thought about one of the favorite names for one of them was the Dum Dum Daycare. Okay. They let the kids name it, and it was Dum Dum Daycare. But it was revolutionary that that they were providing those kinds of services in a structured and institutional way. Reproductive rights was another one that it was just the beginning of all of this energy and all of this creativity and really cognitive understandings of what is the world about and what makes it tick and how does that affect everyone.
Yeah, you do a nice job of explaining the energy of that period.
It was really, and women's music at that time, the genre of women's music in which the songs were about women, about children, about their lives, and really, when you hear music that is the way that I think is traditional, is that it doesn't talk about it from a female perspective of their lives and what happens. And that music at Chris Williamson and Meg Christian and Teresa Trull, I mean, just all of these women and this music and this incredible, at the time that we're doing all this hard work, we also are being soothed by music. And that became really important in my personal life. To be able to have that, to replenish, to refill.
So there was a cultural dimension too.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. There was a women's restaurant called Grace and Ruby's, which provided us a community meeting place where we could eat, recreate, have discussions, things like that. And that it was kind of the hub of a community. And so whenever you have that, you're going to have a lot of people connecting and talking and being able to really have a community.
Was early rape victim advocacy sort of experimental in nature? I mean, I would imagine that you didn't have guidebooks to consult or that there were very few academic resources for you at the time?
Right. Oh, yeah. None of the books. I mean, you saw the library the other day. It's packed, as I know other topics about women and children are just plentiful. And at the time, we had, against our will, and this Florence Rush talked about incest, sexual abuse of children, which was a radical thing to do, and very interesting. In that, I had mentioned the other day about Freud's 1896 original paper on child sexual abuse, which I was saying to you that I think that other than changing the date, it would be germane at this time. And what he was finding is that lots of his patients were talking about being sexually abused by their fathers and by other people. And of course what happened at that time is that the psychiatric community went nuts and did everything that they could to shun him, to say, you can't say this, you can't do this, our clients come from these folks. And so what he ended up doing is recanting. And then that's when we got all of the theories about women wanting to sleep with their fathers and boys with their moms and all this kind of stuff. And actually, to me, the way I understand it is that it was more of a response to be included in his professional community. And that recantation and the following theories continue to affect women negatively today.
And it sounds like it probably had a chilling effect within academia of not studying incest or...
Oh, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, it was risky for anybody who deals with it. You know, you had asked about what the climate was, what the nature was. It was incredibly threatening because what you're threatening is the very power structure of our country. And then as we expanded internationally and understanding, getting more knowledge about other places. But of course, beginning here, looking at where was the power, who had it, how did they maintain it, and who didn't have it.
And also, what is a polite topic to study or talk about?
Yeah, what's okay. And you know, and I hear, it's interesting because I hear about how taboo incest or sexual assault or sex is in other countries, and I think, you know, it seems to me that those things are just as, or were just as much taboo here. And so that's what made it in part so very, very radical, is that to go back to kind of what I was talking about, Freud, so that got suppressed, all that information about abuse got suppressed. And then, as Herman describes in her book Trauma and Recovery, about every 40 years in society, the issue would come up and it would become repressed. And what's so exciting about what happened in the 70s and beyond is that it was like putting the toothpaste back in the tube. It was, everybody was contributing to a body of knowledge, to anecdotal and empirical evidence and research, all the kinds of things that were going to make it stay out in the open.
I think that's an important point that you raised, that history isn't a story of complete repression, that there are periods in which people are more open to talking about things, and then there's...
That's right, where they try and address the social ills, and then it gets pushed down again. And, you know, looking at, and one of the ways of pushing down is violence on the one end, and on invalidation and ridicule and all of those types of tools, you know, all throughout that stop women. And I can remember a woman who, when we were a very young agency, came in and she said, you know, I was going to come in here 4 years ago. And she said, but I didn't, because the man who was abusing her told her that at the Women's Center and at the rape line, they were just lesbians. So with that one word, he didn't have to even kind of say what that meant. It was one that frightened, that sent a very clear message that it would be dangerous to go there because people would, I don't know, make you radical.
So there is perhaps a correlation between homophobia, the sexual oppression of women,
exactly. Children. That's one of the big tools, and has been used with feminists forever, which is, you know, just as men being accused of being gay is a tool of social control, it is also a tool that has been used to keep women separated from each other, and to say, if you if you hang out with these people, you will not get the resources that you would otherwise get.
Or you'll be marked as...
That's right. In other words, if you behave, you'll be rewarded. If you don't, you will not be.
Okay, that's really interesting.
And in fact, it could even go the other way.
Okay. Some of your more recent research has been looking into people who commit violent crimes and sexual assaults. What kinds of misperceptions do you think the public has about people who commit sexual assaults?
You know, a few years ago, I realized that it was, in fact, several years ago, when I was first the director in 1981, I realized it was very important for us to understand as best we could everything that we could about the kinds of people who did these crimes. And part of it was in answer to what victims were asking. They, you know, why did he choose me? Is there something I could have done to get away? Where was God in this? I mean, just all kinds of answers that were very core issues. And so in the sex offender treatment program really is a very young field and began around 1984. And I got a call from Dudley Allison, who was the director of the then new sex offender treatment program at Mount Pleasant Prison, to go down there, and he wanted me to talk about victim impact. And I asked him if I could sit in on groups and talk to these guys about those questions and get to know, because we tend to lump sex offenders together. I think is a kind of a heuristic way of saying just, they're all, get them away from me. But what we've found is that there's a lot of difference among them in terms of what's motivating them, who do they pick as victims, do they stay exclusively with that type of victim, or do they just generally abuse, what is their psychological makeup, in other words, how can we understand and perhaps predict behavior of sexual aggression. And so I was down there and I talked with them, and I will always remember this guy. And of course, when you're hearing, some of them were hearing that, they were feeling, not all of them, but some of them were feeling bad about, because I was talking about how much of an impact it was. And one guy, he said, do you think I should write my victim a letter? And so then we kind of talked about probably that's the worst thing that you could do, and that was really taking care of him rather than the victim. But that was kind of the beginning of understanding. I went in and sat in a group, and I went around the room, and there were child molesters and rapists, and just all of them in the same group. And one guy said, there wasn't anything that my victim could have done. He said, I was going to attack her, and I was going to do it, and there was nothing she could do. Another one was talked about how he was driving this woman out in the country, and she started talking to him about who she was and her family, and asked about his family, and he said, I just couldn't do it then because she had become a real person to me. And I think I gave you the example when we were talking before about an incident in which a woman got off a bus and she felt, it was a dark place, and this guy got off behind her. She felt uncomfortable. She turned to him, and this guy was going to attack her. Turned to him and said, this is a very scary part of town, and it's really dark, and I'm wondering if you could walk me back to my home. And he said, all of a sudden, here he is now. Now he's kind of the hero, right?
Yeah.
And so that shift changed things for him. It doesn't do it for everybody. Some of them, for some, it's an educational issue, not nearly as much as we'd like to think. But for others, they intended to hurt people. And so victim impact isn't really very effective with them, other than validating what they did. So from 1984 on, I then worked with, I just need to lay a little foundation here.
Okay.
I worked with sex offenders in community corrections, and then also in prison settings, and in a mental health setting. And so in thinking about the guys who really are the sociopaths, the ones who all of them are extremely selfish, but the sociopaths simply see the world as something to use, and people are interchangeable, they're just simply objects. And so what we had to do is develop a cost-benefit analysis for how the offender had suffered, which was so counter to what I was about. I wanted a moral argument. I wanted them to just know that they did it badly.
To feel guilty themselves.
That's right.
Yeah.
And it wasn't realistic. But if you talked about how they'd lost their job, their family, they had to be at sex offender treatment group with me once a week. I mean, all of these kinds of things that
So you had to prove to these men that they were suffering as a result of their
Exactly.
of their actions. That's really interesting.
Yeah, and so for the past several years, one of the things that we have also done is to put the focus on the offender, because otherwise we look at the victim, what was she wearing, doing, saying, thinking, all of those kinds of things. The focus comes on the offender, and we see, or on the victim, and the offender drops away. It happens in court as well. If you look, the focus is on everything but the offender because the actions are indefensible, and so you have to do something else. And it's been a very effective thing to do, to blame the victim or to keep the focus on the victim or somewhere else.
And it seems like historically we've always looked at the actions of the victim and the decisions that they made, when it sounds like often there's very little that the victim could have done differently.
Right, and also that you have to have a context and you have to consider what the offender was doing so that her reactions make sense, so that her responses, her fears, her simply, as I said, her overall reaction to a situation makes more sense.
How have the laws changed as a result to the new ways of looking at sexual violence, of looking at perpetrators? For example, you mentioned when we spoke that the laws used to be that women had to prove that they'd struggled in order to prove that that a rape had been committed.
That's
they had
right.
to show bruises and evidence of a struggle. How has this changed?
It's changed dramatically, and not that long ago. What happened is that they took the word rape out of the legislation, and they also made it so that it wasn't necessary for a woman to have proof that she fought back, that she struggled physically. Because what was happening is that women were, in order to prove that it wasn't their fault, they didn't want it to happen, were oftentimes fighting back, and in some cases, with some offenders, you're going to get hurt worse. In the majority of the cases that we get, and kind of in general, 85% of the cases involve somebody the victim knows and trusts. And in those kinds of cases, they didn't have cuts and bruises necessarily. The dynamics were different. And so it was a huge, huge change to look at sexual assault in degrees as well, from ones involving one perpetrator, a sexual assault, no weapon kind of thing, to multiple assailants, a weapon, to first degree, which is serious maiming and scarring, permanent damage. So we saw that whole thing that was kind of a one-size-fits-all and do this, kind of be branched out to say it's a recognition that there are different types of crimes that occur. They're all sexual assault, but the different degrees, the different components to them were different, and to recognize that.
One thing that you also mentioned to me that I found to be really interesting was how there's a continuum of sexual violence, and that it's the people who commit sexual harassment or heckle women on the streets who then get some sort of a thrill out of it and are unchecked in this behavior and then continue and progress to the next level. So what does this mean for sexual harassment policies?
Well, you know, when you look at sexual harassment, I always think of it as kind of an umbrella term that includes lots of different types of behaviors. And it can include the non-touching types of behaviors, from obscene phone calls, catcalling, dirty jokes, to coercion, and kind of on up to hands-on types of offenses and to sexual assault. So what ties all of those things together are the dynamics, the power and the control taken by one person over another. And so in recognizing that, I think it's better, it's an easier way to understand why someone who would get an obscene phone call might be terrified, and also, which is something that is an issue, for example, and that was an educational issue with law enforcement, is that they weren't just harmless, that they weren't offenses that were really of no consequence, and she was just sensitive. One, because it's very scary to not know who's calling you, what their intent is. Are they going to just stop with a phone call, or do they come to your house? I mean, what's going to happen? So it's that power and control on that level. Additionally, many women have had previous experiences. 1 out of 3 women are sexually abused in their life, and that could be low. And 1 out of 4 before the age of 18. And so it's like, you know, there are millions of women who have prior histories, and so when that kind of thing happens, then of course they have flashbacks about what happened, and they know what can happen. And so it was important to also say that, and I heard this from one sex offender, when they call, they make calls, they make those obscene phone calls. So they are, I'd like to think that you've got your obscene phone callers, you've got, you know, your sexual harassers here, you've got all this, you know, the rapists are over here. But that's not how it works. One individual does a whole lot of aberrant behaviors. And so you can't say the guy making the obscene phone call is not not abusing somebody in a worse way, or that they will. So, you know, that they will not abuse the person they're calling. And that's important. Again, getting the focus on the offenders. How do they behave? How do they, you know, in addition to what they do, is what they say. And we tend to not think beyond. I mean, you know, when you talk about sex offenders, there's a lot of knee-jerk stuff. We want to shoot them, hang them, do all kinds of stuff. We don't do that, and because we have that big emotional response, we don't really think about what would be the best way to contain them and also to address safety.
There's been a flurry of press coverage of late about women who make false rape accusations, and I'm thinking about the Duke Lacrosse case and then most recently at Hofstra. Can you contextualize these claims of false rape within the larger landscape of rape victim advocacy?
I can.
Okay.
You know, it's a charge that's made and seems to be and is made freely. And it is part and parcel of how somebody gets out from under a rape charge. They're essentially, you know, there's 3 defenses that people usually use. Either nothing happened, which would be the false, you know, the lying, or yeah, there was sex, but it was consensual, or the other one is no, I'm not the guy you got. It happened, it was consensual, but maybe it had been consensual, but it wasn't him. Well, DNA is pretty well taking care of that last one. And so what happens is that the myths around that don't just exist as an educational issue. Because if they were, people wouldn't be saying that anymore, right? I mean, we've been out talking about this. They've seen TV shows. I mean, the information is there, but the behavior still continues. Those myths are alive and well. And when you look at that, it's because it's serving somebody. It's serving a purpose. And we as a community do not want to think that this kind of thing happens in our community. We certainly don't want to think that it's somebody that we might know or that we admire or who's been close to us. And so there's a collective kind of denial that wants to say boys will be boys, it doesn't happen here. Women, if women are whores,
or he's a wealthy executive, he would have no incentive to commit rape, or
that's right.
Everyone likes this popular athlete. There's no reason why he'd ever need
that's
to rape.
That's right. And calling them, I think it's called shirt chasers, where they just everybody wants to have sex with a prominent athlete, which of course is ridiculous, and does not get to the. Let me get back just a little bit about the false reporting. You hear a recantation, and in the paper, that's above the fold news. And usually what has happened is that there's been so much pressure on a victim to drop the complaint. Oftentimes, and we know this from some of the big high-profile cases we've seen, victims are threatened, their lives are threatened, their reputations are impugned. There are, people who are clearly lashing at them, and intense pressure to not get this guy in trouble, which, of course, the guy gets himself in trouble, but it's made to sound like this woman is, because of whatever's going on with her, and there are lots of things that people say, that she would make up this charge. Now, so false reporting, if you look at all of the types of crimes, there are no more any false reports. In other words, there's about 2% of the reports are considered to be not founded in the facts. Those are weeded out relatively early because the system is set up, of course, to make sure that there is veracity to the complaint. So the likelihood of a report that somehow somebody was vindictive or something would get to the trial level, it would be almost nil. I mean, I'd say nil, but then somebody would say, well, you can't ever say nil. And so, and yet it remains like right prominent. People think if you were to do a survey, oh yeah, that happens a lot. Now, I have seen cases where there have been mental health issues, which are obvious, and are ones that should be dealt with in the mental health realm. In some cases, I'm just trying to think, it's hard to, I don't have examples of people who have falsely reported trying to get somebody in trouble. There are lots of easier ways to get somebody in trouble than to put yourself into that situation.
Right.
And that's another popular myth is that, she was late getting home, so she had to tell her boyfriend she was raped. That doesn't make sense, and it would be something that people would believe if they had not, if they didn't have the awareness or agree to think about this in a serious way.
Okay. Would you comment on the role of binge drinking in a college town on sexual violence and how that influences your work?
Yes. Alcohol is the number one date rape drug, or rape drug for that matter. We have a lot of cases that are involving alcohol in which alcohol was used to incapacitate the victim and also to interfere with memory. It's common in the types, as I said, 85% are something the victim knows, so it might be somebody at a party, it might be at an event, something where there's alcohol, it's readily available, and it's kind of in our culture. If you think about the jokes and the media portrayals in movies, things like that, of I'm going to get her drunk and then I can have sex with her. So the legislature, by the way, took that into account, and part of the definition of against the will or without consent is that if they are inebriated or if they are unconscious, it's sexual assault. And I'm always amazed at that because, either a victim has protested and the offender hasn't listened, or they have been too frightened and so they have laid still, just hoping it's over, get out of here, or they're unconscious. So when you're thinking about, okay, this is a sexual encounter, it can't be a good sexual encounter. It has to be one person meeting their own needs over another.
I think this is such a difficult issue because from reading the Daily Iowan and talking to students, it seems that a number of students see going out to the bars as being somewhat empowering. It's an adult behavior to be able to drink and to be able to socialize with their friends. It's clearly not public behavior that they were able to do when they were in high school, for example. So they're behaving like adults. They perceive it to be a freeing experience. But it sounds like what you're saying is that there are people who are looking for this type of behavior. There are people who are on the lookout for people who are drinking too much to exploit that.
Exactly. And the thing is that a lot of times, as on the self-blaming types of things, people blame the victim for going out, for dressing attractively, for whatever she was doing, or he. And when in fact those types of behaviors we do all the time, and we don't get hurt. The only time it becomes risky behavior and dangerous is when there's an offender about.
Right.
Offenders look for availability, vulnerability, accessibility, and they're going to gravitate to where there is a population. But that also, it's important, I think, to look at that there's sexual violence in intimate partner relationships, in cases where, and that makes sense then in terms of how it is used in a party-type atmosphere. An offender and also some victims have described how that happens in a house party, for example, where there'll be a punch bowl for the women and a keg for the guys. And that's really alarming because it really has kind of a normalization of inappropriate and aberrant behavior, almost like a weekend recreation activity in which it's been described that there are rooms that are set up for the whoever the guy is to take the victim to, and sometimes there are other people in there, there are other guys in there, or that's where that person is going to assault them. So there's a study by David Lisek, who is a leading researcher in sex offenders, and he did a very large study on college men, in which he asked, they put forth this idea that if here are the behaviors that constitute sexual assault. Have you ever done these? And then the question was, if did you ever sexually assault somebody and get away with it? And the response was overwhelming. But out of that study came a brief video called The Undetected Rapist. And in that, there is a student who's talking about those experiences and how they get set up and how normal they are in terms of planning and that kind of thing. So there's a real element of cooperation that is very, very troubling.
So in these instances, when men organize parties, plan to have a punch bowl reserved for women and a keg for men, do you find that the men who organize them are likely not to consider themselves to be rapists because their friends are doing it, therefore they couldn't be a rapist?
Right. I think there is a big disconnect between somebody real, and you saw that with the sex offenders all the time. It was a compartmentalization about being a good guy and just sowing your oats. Or whatever term you want to use. I gave an example of, and this is about a minister who had sexually abused thousands of kids over the years and had gotten the Foster Parent of the Year award and was, in the community, he was a leader. And so I had an opportunity to ask him, how did you do that? How do you do that in your head so that you can at once, you should be at a higher standard. You're responsible for these people's spiritual well-being and advising them, and you have trust just given to you. So on the one hand, you have that, and on the other hand, you're abusing these kids all over the place. And he said, oh, that's easy. He didn't even hesitate. That always bothered me. He said, this was my public life, this was my job, this was my private life. And in the offenders that I dealt with, that kind of compartmentalization was striking. I mean, it was just, there were cognitive distortions that were breathtaking. And I think that there's that kind of justification of behavior, and whether it's somebody who, there's some guys who have tumultuous relationships, jealousy, power, violence, all kinds of controlling things, checking the cell phone, reading emails, I mean, just being really invasive and totally controlling an individual's life. And in those kinds of cases, seeing the violence go throughout all of that, and they have to do something in their head. And so it's interesting, it's always been fascinating to me how they explain that kind of thing. Right. And how they take the kind of edge off of being a sex offender. One said, well, yeah, I committed a sex offense. I won't say I'm an offender, but I committed a sex offense. I should have stopped and I didn't. But there were things that she could do too. So it's trying to make kind of an equal responsibility, a justification for that type of out of control behavior.
And one thing that you mentioned to me was that a lot of men will make a concerted effort to be really friendly to everyone that they encounter, so that they're regarded as that nice guy, that harmless guy.
Sure. I mean, because all of us are looking for the ones who are scary looking, and you cross the street and whoa. And there are some of those. But the majority of the ones that I worked with, if you walked into the room, it looked like a room full of guys. And so if you think about how do you get victims, how do you gain the trust of people, some of them have great senses of humor. They're very funny. They're engaging. They're, attractive. And so what ends up happening is that they gain trust. They're able to get close to victims in order to be sexually aggressive. That makes sense to me in terms of if you're nasty to somebody, then you're going to have to be overtly violent and controlling. But if what you want to do is kind of sneak up on somebody and be able to successfully sexually assault them, then you're going to want to be nice or funny or attractive.
Okay, one thing that our viewers might be interested in looking at is the RVAP website, rvap.org. Can you tell them what resources are available on that website?
I can. A couple of years ago, what we did is we totally revamped our website to have a number of audiences, the first of which would be people who have been sexually abused or assaulted or victims of harassment of some sort. And what we wanted to be able to do is have the information right there on victim impact, on things that, blaming, self-blame, shame, all of those types of life issues that are affected, which, if you look at a life and how it's impacted by violence, virtually every aspect is affected. Your trust, sense of control, relationships, identity, sexuality, sex and sexuality, all of those types of really core issues are affected by an assault. And what it does is it isolates victims. It breaks off their bond to other people. For example, if you know your offender, some people might think, oh, well, it's not as scary because you know this guy, right? But what really happens is that it is even more scary, because here was somebody that you thought was safe. And it calls into question then, why do I think I'm safe in other areas?
Yeah.
And that includes if somebody, for example, tells a friend or a family member about an assault and their reaction is to blame them or to do something. And it's like, oh my God, I thought I could, count on you, and I can't. And so now I have to figure the world out all over again.
And I think something that's useful about this website is that if somebody perceives that they're being stalked, or if they've been the victim of a sexual assault, the resources are all online. There are step-by-step directions as to what to do, characteristics to write down, information about recording the time of calls, about saving emails, about who to contact after a sexual assault. So I think that the public would find that to be really useful. How to donate to RVAP.
That's a good one, too,
Yeah.
because that furthers then, of course, our ability to help people.
Right.
But there is, for example, you don't learn how to be a crime victim. You don't learn how to prepare a case. You shouldn't have to.
Right.
None of us should have to. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, some do. Mm-hmm. And so in a stalking case, for example, there are two issues, really. One is safety. Number one is safety. And number two is collecting evidence and being able to elicit the help of law enforcement or the institutional administrators. And so in here are, in addition to kind of overall issues about what victims face, there are also kind of lists of things that give that kind of advice. Keep all of this, like with domestic violence, have a kit ready to go. And so what we wanted to do was really be able to, on several different dimensions, have ready at the, right there, have information on healing, on resources, on practical matters.
It's a wonderful website. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Next, on each episode of Women at Iowa, we ask people who are being interviewed to recommend a book to the audience, a book that's perhaps influenced your thinking about your career. What book would you recommend to our audience?
A book about my career.
Or just a book that you find turn to in your consciousness a lot.
Actually, there's and I was trying to find it just before I came here, but there's a passage in Once and Future King, and it talks about, and I wish I had found it because it's really a good one, but it says, it talks about the thing for being sad is to learn new things. And it talks, and it's very, goes into learn how the world works, and to learn about math and chemistry and cutting wood and all of those kinds of things. And I think it's very important to me in terms of my own journey of using music and also of maintaining curiosity. Mm-hmm. What we know from brain research on trauma is that the person really essentially lives in that emotional fight, flight, freeze mode. Mm-hmm. And so, for example, things that might trigger it, if they'd been assaulted by somebody who smoked, they smell smoke, the adrenaline's going to fire off. And so how do you, and so what happens then is that part of the brain is running the show. And what goes offline is the cognitive ability, the ability to be curious and to be interested and to form planning. And so to me, it's very important that we re-engage for people or help people re-engage that part of their brain that is curious, that is, that is connected to the world again. Because what we're trying to heal is aloneness. And so for me, that curiosity, that being able to do music, where and I play guitar and I sing, and it's an important part of being able to, without words, and sometimes with words, but with the music, to be able to go straight to the heart. Mm-hmm. And that's where I take the greatest satisfaction, not only in my personal life, but also in working with people, is being able to reach that creative part again, and to realize that offenders haven't taken that away.
Right. Well, that's a wonderful note for us to conclude on, is that your work isn't bleak, that your work ultimately is hopeful, that you are putting people back together again.
Yeah, well, they're putting themselves together, and we're helping them along the way. They come to us as experts of what happened to them in their life and their skills. And then we have some information and some things that we can share. And so going together.
It's truly empowering.
Yeah, it's truly empowering. And I'll tell you, a lot of times people will ask, how do you stay in this work? Because a lot of it is grim and very, very hard. And it is seeing that happen with somebody, see them make connections and see them understand things in a way that they don't have to blame themselves, or they don't have to take responsibility for what happened, that in fact they are reacting normally to what happens to them.
Okay, well, thank you, Karla Miller, and thank you for joining us at Women at Iowa.
Thank you.